Good morning and thanks for coming. My name is Sean Maher. I'm the Executive Director of Social Planning Toronto, which is a research and public policy charity that operates in the City of Toronto. And I'm here today with Alejandra Ruiz-Varga from Acorn and with Councillor Mike Layton from the City of Toronto. And we're all here on behalf of over 60 organizations from across the province of Ontario who've written an open letter to the Minister of Housing pleading with him to withdraw and amend the draft regulations that have recently been published around inclusionary zoning because they result in an effective withdrawal of the legislation that came out last year that potentially had the capacity to create an enormous amount of affordable housing, but under these regulations is unlikely to produce that positive benefit. Alejandra will start, and Councillor Layton will speak, and then I'll provide some background information on the technical aspects of inclusionary zoning. Alejandra.
Thank you, Sean. So we are here in a housing crisis in Ontario. It is affecting a growing portion of our population in many disturbing ways. As a membership group of low to moderate income families, Acorn is determined to get the governments to wake up and realize they must do everything in their power to make as much affordable housing as possible. If this were a natural disaster, the government will rush with money and tools to rebuild. If it were a stock market crash, the government will rush to bail out the companies who went bankrupt. Why not with housing? Why do they not treat a crisis that is affecting so many people as seriously? There are people dying on the street and thousands waiting on lists to get subsidized units. So many Acorn families that I know could pay for a reasonable price apartment, but can no longer afford the skyrocketing rents. The housing crisis that needs full attention. We need to build and restore social housing. We need real rent control, and we need to ensure that developers and their condos are not making the problem worse. As a province, you had the responsibility to provide for your people an inclusionary zoning policy that will maximize the amount of deeply affordable units buildings. The sale prices of new housing units had gone up by 300%, 3 times over the last decade. Safe to say that profits of developers have too. Have our wages, our pensions, our salaries? Of course, they have not gone up that much. The developers need to pay their share, and the province needs to make inclusionary zoning rules that make that as easy as possible. Ontarians need relief from the housing crisis. We are holding the provincial government accountable to make sure that they use their powers and to end the housing crisis. Getting deep affordability out of new housing developments through inclusionary zoning is what we need from the province today. They owe the people of Ontario that. Thank you.
Good morning. Cities around the province are growing fast, and despite the increase in housing, the cost is also increasing dramatically. At the same time, cities across Ontario are facing an affordability crisis. While the city and province benefit from more housing and greater density focused in our urban centres, the clear winners are the developers and their investors. Availability is simply not enough to keep things affordable. One important tool being used by other jurisdictions is mandating developers to build affordable housing in new development that is over a certain size, through a power sometimes called inclusionary zoning. The use of inclusionary zoning is contemplated in the City of Toronto Act, but the province has never adopted the necessary regulations to bring this to reality. Inclusionary zoning is used in cities across the U.S. New York City's mandatory policy applies to specific neighborhoods with 20 to 30% affordable housing, which are keeping those prices for sales and rentals well below market rent at market rates. Had Toronto been given the authority over the last decade with just 10% affordable units in new development, we would have resulted in 12,000 affordable units. That is an incredible number of units and a lost opportunity for Ontario. After years of municipalities and housing advocates begging successive ministers to introduce the regulation, sadly, the proposed regulation have missed the mark and won't meet the needs of Ontario municipalities and residents. The proposed rules don't address the needs of communities. They favor developers' bottom lines over the health of city budgets and the needs of people struggling to find affordable places to live. The new rules fail in 3 ways. First, the rules strip powers from municipalities to shape their housing policy and put it in the hands of profit-motivated developers. Second, the number of units, the set-aside, is far too low and for too short a period of affordability. Third, the province is proposing to require the city pay developers, but doesn't allow the city to use the value additional density as the contribution, which is a common practice elsewhere. So how do the proposed rules take power away from cities? For one, the rules don't apply to new rental buildings, only ownership buildings. So developers can opt out by simply building luxury rental. Another way it limits the powers of municipalities is by giving developers the choice to determine if the new units are affordable rental or affordable purchase. The province must restore cities the power to shape their own housing policies. Cities have different needs and they should be reflected in their region's policies. So what about the set-aside and affordability period? Well, requiring 5% of units and 10% in areas served by major public transit pales in comparison to other cities. In comparable jurisdictions, the rate is 15 to 20% and higher in some cities. Each percent represents hundreds of units a year and needs to be maximized. On top of the set-aside, the affordability period also needs to be strengthened. The affordability period is only 20 years. 20 years. That's barely a generation. We can do better. Many other jurisdictions have gone well beyond 20 years, and according to the Wellesley Institute, 30% of U.S. cities have affordability periods of 99 years or longer. There is no reason we shouldn't maximize the period or simply make it in perpetuity. The province must strengthen the set-aside and the affordability period to ensure this policy makes a difference. Now, how is the province picking the municipal pockets to line the pockets of developers? They are requiring the cities to pay the developers 40% of the value of the units. Let me repeat that. The province is making the city pay developers 40% of the value. Worse yet, the province is restricting the power of municipalities to pay for the affordable units by restricting the use of Section 37 and density bonuses. To be honest, cities are already making better deals than this with developers in new development. Many municipalities simply won't undertake this strategy because it will cost too much. Powers to waive development charges and other fees will need to be paid from somewhere, and given most of them are cost recovery to cities, the city is going to have to pick up that cost. Municipalities create value for developers by upzoning their projects, and this costs the municipality financially in new services. Developers should shoulder the majority of the burden of the cost paid for by the profits that cities create for them. The province must put the financial health of municipal governments ahead of the profits of developers. Now developers will claim that the cost will be passed on to cash-strapped homebuyers. But let me ask you this. Do developers currently sell their units for less than the market allows? The answer is no. Developers will always charge what the market will pay, not the costs that are reflected in fees from the cities. To conclude, the province must give cities the power to shape their own housing policies. Cities have different needs and they should be reflected in their own policies. The province must strengthen the set-aside and the affordability period to ensure this policy makes a difference. The province must put the financial health of municipal governments ahead of the profits of developers. Let's not miss another opportunity like we have over the last decade. Thank you.
Thank you. After years of raising this issue and through concerted work by municipalities and communities, the province of Ontario, to its credit, passed inclusionary zoning legislation last year. That came about through extensive discussion with comprehensive input from developers and communities on the key issues that affect inclusionary zoning and what makes it work: set-asides, durations, incentives. And when it came time to pass the legislation, the province chose wisely. They followed solid evidence on how inclusionary zoning works and gave municipalities the option to design their own policies to reflect their own housing markets and their own needs. Because the housing market in Windsor and Kingston and Toronto and Belleville aren't the same, and a single cookie-cutter set of rules is not going to work in all those jurisdictions. Distressingly, on Friday afternoon, 2 days before Christmas, draft regulations came out that undid all of those good decisions. The proposed regulations are not just a concern for us at Social Planning Toronto, but for organizations across the province. Today, we're releasing an open letter to the Minister calling on Ontario to abandon the current draft regulations and return to the strategy that they adopted in the legislation. The changes that so many organizations are asking for are not just preferences or opinions. They are the best evidence we have on what makes inclusionary zoning work. We have hundreds of cities and towns across North America that are using inclusionary zoning. So we aren't guessing when we talk about what makes it work. We're working from solid evidence. In fact, Social Planning Toronto recently released this study that shows what are the patterns of success and what are the patterns of challenges when you develop inclusionary zoning strategies. And sadly, the draft regulations published by the ministry fly directly in the face of all of the evidence that we have. On set-asides, the amount of affordable housing developers can be asked to create, the province has set strict limits. 5% of the units will be affordable, 10% if it's close to a high-volume transit site. That's a very rare practice in North America. That kind of cap is very unusual. 20% is far more common. Hundreds of municipalities have set-asides of 20% or more. New York City has set-asides that go up to 30%. The right position in the regulation is to have no cookie-cutter approach, no province-wide set-asides, but let municipalities define their set-asides according to their own housing markets, because they vary so much. The new draft regulation also bans cities from making units affordable for longer than 30 years. Why would anyone prevent the greatest duration of affordability? It makes no sense. All it does is kick the province down the road. All it does is kick the problem down the road to the next generation. In fact, U.S. jurisdictions that originally adopted 30-year affordability periods are finding that those periods are coming to an end, and they've manufactured for themselves a new affordable housing crisis by setting these short duration limits. That's why more and more municipalities are setting 99-year or perpetual affordability periods in order to make sure that housing is affordable for generation after generation. The most bizarre of the regulations imposes what they call measures and incentives. Payments municipalities and their taxpayers must pay to developers in order to support them in complying with the law. These are incredibly uncommon in U.S. jurisdictions. They're rarely contemplated and even less frequently used. Cash payments to developers from taxpayers make no sense, not in Toronto, not in any place in Ontario, and frankly not in any place in North America. But this bizarre provision shifts cost burdens from highly profitable developments to taxpayers. It also sets a limit on the pace at which inclusionary zoning is likely to generate affordable housing units. Municipalities will look to their treasuries to decide what volume of housing they'll support, rather than to what the market will bear. So we're calling on the minister to reverse the destructive regulations and return to the evidence-based, practical approach that was in the legislation, because these regulations, as they're currently written, will mean that few, if any, affordable homes are created under inclusionary zoning. Letting municipalities define inclusionary zoning to match their housing markets and their needs is the right approach. It's the approach that's in the legislation. It's the approach that the evidence supports, and we call on the minister to return to that approach. Thank you.
The government is likely to make changes to their regulation. They've already said that once the rule closes for comment, they're going to take all of the public input they've received and come up with something at least somewhat new. If there was a single sort of biggest bang for the buck change that you would want to see in this regulation, what would do the most good?
Municipal option. The fundamental problem with these regulations is that it binds all municipalities to a single pattern. So Toronto has to come up with exactly the same inclusionary zoning policies that Kingston or Windsor or Belleville have to come up with. Municipalities need the freedom to, without compensation, set their affordability periods and their set-asides.
What? Are you saying you're sorry, what?
Well, I think I would say the same thing. Or the regulations now are very much putting the power to make the decisions in the hands of developers, whether or not units are going to be rental, whether or not they're going to be what the affordability, not the affordability period, but where they will be. We need to restore that power to the municipalities so they can make independent decisions that address the housing needs within their communities. We may just see developers figuring out ways to then maneuver around some of the rules, like building luxury rental, for instance.
Just asking, is the original draft, you're saying that was fine the way it was? What were some of the highlights of the original draft that you liked?
The legislation doesn't limit set-asides, it doesn't limit affordability periods, it doesn't require compensation. It says what permissive legislation, which is what inclusionary zoning normally is, should say, which is we're going to give the municipalities the tools to make the right choices, and we're going to count on those governments to be responsible stewards of their affordable housing policies.
What about, you probably heard Milshin or read Milshin's piece in the Toronto Star saying this takes away the burden from councillors, not having to worry about creating these side deals, etc. They're making your job easier.
Well, I would say that they're making it easier by giving the power to developers to shape city's housing policy. The reality is the city won't be in charge of trying to fill gaps within their housing stock. What we'll be at is at the mercy of developers to build that housing stock to suit their needs. And they have one need. It's the need for profit. They're for-profit companies. Like, I'm not faulting them for that. But if they're going to find ways to maximize their profits through use of this, which is going to likely result in less affordable housing getting built.
And it's also unusual. I mean, municipalities across North America use this tool. A lot of them use it very, very well. New York City's inclusionary housing policy is one that's widely respected. But they develop the policy to match their local housing needs and their local housing markets. A single pattern of inclusionary zoning that tries to treat the housing market in Bowmanville and Toronto as if they're exactly the same just doesn't make any sense.
You want to see, should get, you say, a good 20%, that's pretty much what you're asking for, is for the percentage of affordable housing the developers should be creating with new projects?
So what we're asking for is that municipalities have the flexibility to set the right level for their own constituencies. Certainly the pattern in North America is to say the caps lower than 20% don't make any sense at all. New York has 30%. A vibrant housing market like Toronto's could certainly bear 30%, at least in some neighborhoods. So we're asking the province to not get in the way of cities who are trying to create affordable housing.
Yes, and I totally agree with Sean and Mai say. And what we are asking as organization, as the people of Ontarians, is that the government, the provincial government, do a good law that really benefit the people and let the municipalities do their job, because every city is different.
I think it's important also to point out that affordable housing isn't necessarily without profit on its own. The definition of affordability that the city uses is the average market rent of the city. We certainly would like to see deeper affordability in some cases, and I can use an example. The Mirvish Village development is at the former Honest Ed's site is going quite a bit deeper. We've already achieved 10% with some support from various other available funds. But that's slowly increasing to 20%, which was our goal. But these are units that are being rented, in this case rented, or in the case of sale, for the average rent or for the average cost of housing. It's not that the developer is somehow having to hand over units at zero value to them.
Mike, when the city wants to build the Gardner East, it spends billions of dollars of property taxes. When it wants to build the Scarborough Subway, it spends billions of dollars in property tax money. When you want affordable housing, you want developers to bear the full cost, and you want the city to not have to pay property tax money to do that. Why is the Gardner East more important than affordable housing?
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out. I voted against both of those allocations of city funds. I don't believe that they are more important than housing. I certainly would like to see that money go to other things, other priorities that the city has.
You're here saying that property taxpayers should not have to pay for affordable housing.
Well, what I'm saying is there's value created through the rezoning process for developers, and some of that value should come back in the way of affordable units to the city, which would be valuable to us. I don't think that it's fair to say that the city wouldn't contribute at all. Like I said, an affordable unit is considered market rent. There's much deeper subsidy that needs to go into ensuring everyone has access to housing, like housing allowances or ensuring there's some rent geared to income units. That is something that all levels of government need to contribute to, because to be quite honest, it's all of our problem. And in the absence of the federal and provincial governments, the city should do what's necessary, but instead, and the model that's been developed over the many decades is that all levels of government contribute in one way. A lot of that work that the city does is through administering funds from other levels of government as well, to ensure that we have access to those units. But the city's budget for repairing our own city affordable housing, community housing stock is a rather sizable contribution from our budget.
And I think you'll find that in other jurisdictions, developers are asked to contribute what the market will bear to inclusionary zoning, and municipalities use their resources to make deeper subsidies for units that are more affordable for people living on lower incomes. If we tie the city's money up in just getting the developers to participate in inclusionary zoning, then those deeper subsidy units are going to be even harder to get. So cities do need to invest, but capitalizing on what the market fully will bear in contributions from developers is also valuable to have.
The government has said to me that one of their primary concerns is that not the other jurisdictions you talk about in the U.S. that have used inclusionary zoning, not all of them are hot supply-constrained markets like Toronto or New York or San Francisco. The places that have had inclusionary zoning the longest were places that built a ton of housing. Yeah. And we have a supply-constrained market, and their concern is if you give Toronto everything it wants, you're actually going to make the affordability crisis worse in this city.
No, if you give Toronto everything it wants, we'll have more affordable housing than we have now. We would have had 12,000 units more if we'd had it 10 years ago, and we will have more units the sooner we can get the city the power to bring in inclusionary zoning. We're in the middle of a housing boom in Toronto. We're building more units of housing every year than we ever built before. The notion that somehow there's just not enough ways to build is completely contradicted by just looking at the skyline and counting the cranes.
What about Milchan's going to say that this is not the final draft and he's still getting input from advocates? Are you confident that he's willing to work with? Are there meetings planned to continue these discussions? I think
that's very encouraging, and we are here to present what we think are changes that are made, and we value the opportunity to give input, but that input is we need to see some significant change.
It's like a red flag, a warning of don't go in that direction.
Yeah, we're very eager to see the next draft. There are some fundamental changes that are needed. We've certainly been talking to the minister and the minister's office, and we're encouraged that they're not trying to stick to their guns on this one, but recognizing the need to change. But we need to be really clear. The change has to be quite substantial. Significant changes in set-asides and far more municipal flexibility. And a complete removal of the requirements of having taxpayers subsidize developers, which makes no sense at all.
Were developers behind these regulations, this draft that came out?
I wasn't there when they wrote them, so you'd have to ask the minister that.